Emily, for should I? Oh,
Hi, welcome everybody to the Online Peace Science Colloquium, and I'm Emily Ritter of the University of California, Merced, and I'm the coordinator of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. Today we have a very exciting project from Brian Phillips, who is at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City, or as it is more commonly known, CIDE. And he's going to present a project today that's entitled Drain the Swamp or Decapitate, Forced Disappearances and Leadership Targeting in 1970s Argentina. We're joined today by four esteemed discussants who will be giving great feedback on this project. First, we have Cyanne Loyle, who is an assistant professor of political science at Indiana University. We have Jacob Aronson, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for International Development and Conflict Management at the University of Maryland. We have Ursula Daxecker, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Amsterdam and she should be sleeping probably, but she's joining us today, which we really appreciate. And we also have Yuri Zhukov, who's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. So thank you all for being here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to give us a talk.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks for the opportunity and for coordinating all of this, and to Peter. And also, of course, a huge thanks to Jacob, Ursula, Cyanne, and Yuri for taking the time to provide comments. I really appreciate it. And let me switch over to the full screen to put up the presentation. One sort of administrative note before beginning. As I was mentioning to Emily and Cyanne before, I'm actually in Argentina right now. So if there are comments about additional data I could gather while here, qualitative or quantitative, that would be helpful. But of course, all comments are very welcome. Okay, so to begin, Drain the Swamp or Decapitate, Forced Disappearances and Leadership Targeting in 1970s Argentina is the at least tentative title of the talk. And the slides are not advancing. Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
How do indiscriminate and discriminate repression affect insurgent violence? I think the question's interesting for a few reasons. First, it speaks to the policy-oriented literature on effectiveness of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics, and also to work on dynamics of subnational violence. Beyond looking at why do civil wars start in certain countries or in certain years, there's interesting work looking at variation in violence over time, and also topics such as how does protest or sporadic terrorism turn into a full-scale civil war, and in particular, how do government actions make that more likely? And then, of course, there's also the work on consequences of repression that a lot of people here have worked on, looking at things with indiscriminate repression, mass killings, aerial bombardment during the Vietnam War or in other contexts, or widespread human rights violations. What are the consequences of this type of repression? But also, I would argue the other side of the coin, looking at more discriminate repression. For example, killing or capturing members of militant groups or their leaders. And with this paper, I'm trying to contribute to reconciling work on these two different types of repression. And when I say repression, I should clarify that I'm talking about a very general sense of the term, referring to government coercive actions trying to deter dissent. The argument I present in the paper builds on two dimensions regarding militant groups, their incentives to retaliate and their organizational capacity to do so. Indiscriminate repression should have a certain set of consequences. It should provide insurgents incentives to retaliate. When the public is being attacked, this creates a great opportunity for militant groups to show that they can protect these individuals in the public. And this gets at a classic notion of civil wars as contest between some challenger and the state over the public, over public support. So indiscriminate repression can be important in that regard. But regarding effects on organizational capacity, it's not clear that there should be immediate effects on a militant group's capacity to attack. If it's equally likely that the government attacks a random civilian as it is a member of the group, it's not clear there's going to be a short-term effect on the group's ability to respond. Maybe in the longer term, yes. Maybe in the longer term, there's a backlash that helps the group, but shorter term, it's not as clear. With discriminant repression, I think it's a different story, where regarding insurgent incentives to retaliate, there are some incentives created by discriminant repression, such as revenge, for example, but there's not the dynamic involving the public, which is a central part of understanding civil conflict. And additionally, there's an interesting difference regarding effects on organizational capacity, where killing or capturing the leader of a militant group, for example, or a head bomb maker or regional commander can have important effects. And I think a lot of research has shown that. There's also research showing that there are different conditional factors, as Jenna Jordan and others have shown. But overall, I think a lot of work shows that the discriminant repression can be quite effective. So overall, the two hypotheses are that indiscriminate repression should be followed by increased insurgent violence, while discriminant repression should be followed by decreased insurgent violence. And in the paper, I go through the case with an illustrative case study of the Argentine situation, going over the history. I'm not going to do that here because of time, but I am happy to discuss more the history of the case, and I have some slides with the history and certain qualitative examples, some illustrative examples that are consistent with the hypotheses. But here I'll go straight to the quantitative analysis, where I look at Argentine province months between 1969 and 1979. And the time is dictated by the dependent variables availability. But I also think this is a really good set of years to examine, because if you know the case, you know that there was a great deal of violence in the mid to late 70s, but that wasn't the only violence. There was violence and two-sided violence from mid-1969 onwards. So I do think it's good to look at as much time as is possible. The dependent variable for insurgent violence, I look at victims of insurgent violence, a count for each province month, and this is not only those killed, but also the injured and the kidnapped. And this comes from a list of more than 4,000 victims. Again, not only those killed, but others as well. Some people don't realize there are so many. But this comes from the most comprehensive analysis that's been done, published just a few years ago by an NGO called the Center for Legal Studies on Terrorism and Its Victims. And they put together a really impressive list looking at 4 prominent newspapers and government records. So they have a very thorough list of all the victims of insurgent violence. The list is a little bit controversial only for the use of the word terrorism in their database. They describe these victims as victims of terrorism. I don't agree with that terminology because, for example, some of the victims were soldiers killed in firefights. So it's not consistent with a lot of notions of terrorism. But people don't debate that this is a solid list of the victims of insurgent violence during this time period in Argentina. Regarding independent variables, for indiscriminate violence, I use the government's measure of disappearance victims in each province month. And I should acknowledge this isn't completely indiscriminate. We could argue this was not totally random, but I think it's relatively indiscriminate in that these were almost never members of militant groups. The vast majority of these people, some of them were supporters of militant groups, but many others were simply believed to have some information about the militant groups. They might have been family members, friends, roommates of a supporter of a militant group. So this was very widespread, the use of disappearances, and at least relatively indiscriminate. And also for discriminant repression, I use a measure of decapitations. There are about 20 instances of high-level members, leaders of militant organizations that were that were killed or arrested by the authorities during this period. And they include a lot of control variables. Democratic month. This case is one reason it's interesting is because there was variation in regime type. For about 3 years in the middle of the 70s, Argentina was democratic, or at least partially democratic. So we have variation there. Also include a spatial lag and other relevant variables, which I'll show you and which I'm happy to discuss. Because a dependent variable is a count with a lot of zeros, I use zero-inflated negative binomial regression, and I include province and year fixed effects. But I can alter the model specification, and the results are pretty robust. Here we see variation in the dependent variable over time, and there is a good deal of variation temporally. This is at the national level. Throughout the period, we see violence. But also there's a lot of variation geographically in a lot of different provinces. Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires in the east, the darker province, has more violence than other provinces, but it's also where 50% of the population lives. So in spite of that, there's still a lot of variation. Regarding disappearances and decapitations, the red lines indicate the numbers of leaders captured or killed, and we see variation throughout the decade in that. Sometimes they caught a few at the same time. Disappearances, there's more of a cluster from 75 to 77 where there were a massive amount of disappearances, but they were occurring in general throughout the period. The results, generally we see that disappearances are associated with increased rebel violence in the following month, while decapitations are negatively associated with rebel violence in the following month. And this is robust, whether we have a naive model with no controls, when we include all the controls. If you introduce a lag-dependent variable into the model, it actually reduces the goodness of fit a little bit. And if you include a lag DV in all the models, sometimes it's insignificant, it's often insignificant. Here it's marginally insignificant. So usually I include it because of the issues it can introduce into the models. There are also debates about negative binomials versus zero-inflated negative binomial, but if you use a regular negative binomial, the results are similar. And as I mentioned before, there was a great deal of violence after the military coup. I didn't mention the coup specifically, but in 76, 77, 78, there was more violence. So some people might want to only look at the years with the most violence, the years that most people refer to as the Dirty War. And if we just look at those years after the military coup of 1976, we see the results are consistent there. We can take out the province or year fixed effects. And the model with no fixed effects, we can include time invariant variables such as the Peronist vote share. If you know the case, you know that Peronism, this political ideology, is important, but apparently it is not associated with rebel violence, so other things are more important here. And finally, in model 7 and 8, there are 6-month lags on the primary independent variables or 12-month lags. And what we see in model 7 is that 6 months out, there's not an association between decapitation and insurgent violence. So this suggests that this is a short-term relationship. While 12 months out in model 8, we see the disappearances is only borderline statistically significant there. So also this is not a long-term effect. And this is interesting, I think, because it suggests that there's not something structural that suggests a permanent relationship between these two variables, but consistent with what we might expect. This is something that has an effect, and that effect fades with time. So overall, I find these results that are consistent with the argument, and they're robust to a number of changes, and I can discuss other changes that they're robust to as well. And to conclude, we find the repression's effects depend on whether the repression is indiscriminate or it's discriminate. And in this case, as some others have found, indiscriminate targeting seems to be counterproductive. It leads to more violence. Some studies have found that, some studies haven't found that, but my results would go in the column of those that suggest that repression can lead to more violence at a later point. And these results, I don't think they're simply correlations. They are consistent with qualitative evidence that I find in the case that I discuss in more detail in the paper, where repression many times did lead to an immediate response by the rebels seeking to show their power, attacking right afterwards, while the qualitative evidence shows that the loss of a leader really affected these groups and their ability to produce violence, but to act in any coordinated way, but especially to produce violence, was really affected by losing a leader. So we see divergent results qualitatively and quantitatively. Regarding this Argentine case in particular, people talk about the disappearances all the time, and obviously it was a horrible tragedy, but it's interesting also, I think the results here suggest that leadership removal also has substantial consequences. And people talk about leadership removal with the PKK or with Sendero Luminoso. Al-Qaeda or groups in Colombia as important cases, but I think this paper suggests that the Argentine case is also interesting for looking at leadership removal. It was important in this case in reducing insurgent violence. Now, overall, in the long run, which tactic was more effective? I don't know that I can really say with a lot of confidence that one or the other caused violence to decrease and then end in the end of the 1970s. I think both were important. Both seem to have been important. However, we do see this difference between short-term and long-term effects for disappearances, where short-term we see the disappearances led to more violence, but I think the longer term, eventually the rebel groups couldn't sustain their entire support base being taken out, just systematically eliminated. And so there's this interesting divergence, I think, between short-term and long-term effects in this case. So in the future, I think thinking about causal mechanisms and how we can clarify causal mechanisms would be helpful. And also, do we see these kind of results in other cases or even globally? Globally, this is tough to show. But in other cases, I think we've seen this happening in Syria, and there's some evidence to suggest that it happened in Peru with Sendero Luminoso and other cases. But this is something I think that we could look at more. But I'll stop here, and thanks again.
I think that's the first talk we've ever had, and before 15 minutes. That was perfect. That was amazing. What a beautiful thing that is. And now we're open for comments for anyone who would like to kick us off. Yes, I am.
All right, let me get myself off mute here. So Brian, I have a bunch of different comments, but I'll just start out with a couple to get us kicked off. The first is, I believe very strongly in starting with something positive. And so let me tell you that at first I really enjoyed the paper, but I think in your introductory setup, you do a really great job of justifying your case and the importance both of the tactics that you're studying, as well as the necessity of studying repression in an authoritarian regime. So I think you do that well, and I wanted to comment on that. I looked for it in the coding, in the footnotes, but didn't see a definition that I was satisfied with for both disappearances and decapitation from a data collection perspective. So you talk about those definitions theoretically, but I've done a bunch of work on disappearances in Nepal, and there's some real variation on how individual human rights NGOs track down what a disappearance actually is. You talk about how the NGO actually went back and heard testimony from cellmates and other sources and things like that. But because I'm familiar with how the data is collected, these things are really important to me. It also looks like you self-coded the decapitation variable. So just a little bit more, I was looking for a little bit more discussion about who these people really are, how they're important, how you define leaders and how they're important, particularly in the Argentine case. So you say founders, top leaders, regional leaders, and other types of important operatives. I think there's probably a lot of thought that went into what an important operative was, and at least in my read, I didn't find that. So that was one of the things that I would punch up a little bit. You did this better in your presentation than I thought you did in the paper, and that is your discussion about the impact of timing. Because that doesn't really reveal itself through the discussion of the theory, right? That comes from your results, but seems to be a pretty big punchline for you at the end, and I think it's a really important finding. So you might want to think about how you want to treat that. In my mind, it should be a bigger part of your pitch and a bigger part of your theoretical story, that a lot of times we talk about the effect on repression, and we may have timing in there, in our models for different tactical effects. But a big part of what you find is not only these differences across tactic, but that this timing component really matters. But if you do that, then I think you need a stronger theoretical story about why the timing matters how. So right now it's a methodological question, whether it's a 1 month lag, whether it's 6 months, whether it's 12 months. And I think as you punch up your timing story, that's going to become less satisfactory to me in the read.
Let me see if Brian wants to respond to some of those, and then we can continue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cyanne. This is very helpful. I won't take too much time, but definitely I need to be careful about who I'm talking about with decapitation, because I think governments in particular are likely to say that everyone is important. And we see this with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they found another number 3 or whatever. So I need to, but that isn't the case here. But I do need to make that clear in the paper. So maybe the public relations person of the group or whatever. So there were some important people like that, but I'll make sure to make that more clear. And definitely with disappearances, I'll check out your work on Nepal and other work on disappearances to be more clear about what's happening, because there is variation, and how these things are coded is quite important. And on time, also, thanks. I'll look into that more. Beyond that, just thank you. Yeah, for these points is very helpful.
Let's get in Ursula, and then do you have some more you want to bring in, Cyanne, before we move forward?
No, that's fine. Let's move to some other people. I'll add my comments later.
Okay, we'll get to all of them. Ursula. I can't. You're frozen.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Can I hear you now? Oh,
can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, too great. I cannot always. But fine. So I want to second what. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to reiterate, what that I think, the framing of well done, nicely done. I think you. And I have the impression you cannot hear me.
Yeah, it's breaking up a little bit. I can hear your sound, but you're kind of pausing. You want to wait a minute? Why don't we try someone else, and then we'll see if your connection is a little bit better.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
And then we'll see maybe if your connection's a bit better. Let's get Yuri, and then we'll try you again.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Brian, really enjoyed your paper. I have a lot of thoughts on different aspects of it, but I want to lead off with a theoretical question. Your theoretical argument rests on the assumption that indiscriminate violence cannot affect short-term organizational capacity. That most of its the idea is that because it increases recruitment through these 3 channels that you identify, we should expect a short-term increase in organizational capacity through this increased recruitment, even if the longer-term consequences are more ambiguous. And mainly I wanted to see more justification of that assumption, because I can see many instances in which time-wise we might see the opposite relationship, where, example, in Aleppo, high-intensity indiscriminate violence makes the rebels keep their head down or makes them flee, although in the long term, recruitment efforts may take some time. These are people you need to to attract to your cause, to train, and by the time they make their presence known on the battlefield, it may be several months or weeks after the initial attack by the government. And so so why would you not expect the opposite of the type of effect that you hypothesize exists, i.e. a short-term capacity decline as rebels keep their heads down, but a long-term capacity increase as more recruits come in?
Brian.
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. I do think regarding the long-term effect, I think the short answer is it depends. I think that longer term, it can really help the rebel groups. That if it doesn't completely eliminate, maybe it's sort of a nonlinear relationship where certain types of indiscriminate violence in the long term really help the rebel groups. At extreme cases, it's going to annihilate the opposition. But that extreme type of repression is difficult. So as long as it's not maybe the most extreme repression, I think the longer term effect is that it should be likely to help the rebel groups. Maybe the Argentine case is one of these extreme cases where it was extreme repression, so the longer term effect was just to eliminate all opposition. Or maybe it was a combination between the repression and effective leadership removal. that they weren't simply repressing the public in general, but they effectively found and killed the leaders of all the groups. So I think it's difficult to know about the long-term effect. Short-term, again, it might be a difference in degrees, that if there's a lot of effective repression, in the short term, it could keep the rebels' heads down. But I guess it depends on how effective it is, and if the rebels themselves feel safe. Maybe there are differences between urban and rural, but if the rebels themselves feel safe, they might be able to attack. I guess maybe it depends on to what extent the indiscriminate violence is affecting the rebels themselves or other people, their supporters. And in the Syria case, the rebels themselves were quite affected, and it wasn't just supporters or just the general public. And maybe in the Argentine case, the rebels themselves were not as affected, at least in the short term, by the indiscriminate violence. But you're definitely right that it could go either way. And part of the answer, I think, has to do with nonlinear relationships or maybe different types of repression. But at the very least in the paper, I'm going to think about that more and try to more effectively argue that indiscriminate violence wouldn't make the rebels flee or make them ineffective at responding violently. And I'll think about more how I could explain why indiscriminate repression, in spite of that in the short term, that they would be able to respond. So thank you. That is a good point. I need to think about more.
Let's have Jacob, and then we'll try Ursula again.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I actually wanted to follow up on the sort of excellent points raised by both Cyanne and Yuri. So let me sort of tackle what Cyanne said first. That I agree too that the timing issue is very important. So sort of reading through the start of the paper, I was kind of primed to expect that you would find that indiscriminate is bad and that selective is good. But then when I got to sort of more the case study section, it was a much more complicated story, right? Where the timing was sort of brought in that maybe initially indiscriminate caused these sort of negative consequences, but then over time, continued sort of state repression built up and really had a sort of a damaging effect on sort of rebel capacity to operate. So there's a sort of disconnect between how I thought you sort of started to set up the paper and then what some of the findings in the case studies, but not necessarily the empirics were. And I think this is a really, really important issue, in part because the conventional wisdom for Argentina is that, in fact, indiscriminate violence did work. So you're trying to go against the story, but then in the case studies, you show that that's actually kind of true, that over long term, it did work. I also think that this possibly suggests kind of interaction between selective and indiscriminate violence, where you get a situation where maybe cleaning up the rebel support base was then also enhanced by sort of attrition of rebel capacities at the same time, and those two things together sort of produced a more sort of beneficial outcome. And that kind of story of an interaction between these two also, I think, contributes to sort of counterinsurgency theory. Where the big problem of search and destroy missions is that sure, you can kill a lot of them, but then they can just sort of recruit and sort of build up their capacities again. So you need to do something like kill a lot of the rebel and potentially sort of clean up their support base so then they can sort of recruit to sort of fill that up. So I think that sort of thinking through that might be kind of very interesting. And I think that that would also be a very sort of novel contribution to think about the interactions between these types of sort of strategies and to figure out if in fact there were sort of interactions there. Another thing, just to sort of build on what sort of Yuri was saying, I wasn't entirely convinced about your theoretical explanations of the ineffectiveness of indiscriminate violence, sort of in the short term. I think there's, it would be good to get a lot more explanation there. And a part that also relates to sort of how you set up the paper. So you set up the paper as trying to arbitrate between sort of competing findings, right? You get sort of mixed findings. Some papers say indiscriminate good, some papers say indiscriminate bad. But then you end up just sort of contributing and saying, well, I just have another finding that indiscriminate is bad. So if you set up the paper as indiscriminate is bad, or I'm sorry, that there's sort of these mixed findings, it would also be beneficial to try to sort of work through maybe indiscriminate is not always bad. What are the conditions under which indiscriminate is bad? And then you would be able to sort of contribute and help arbitrate between these findings, right? You would be able to say, well, under these conditions, this previous study found that indiscriminate is bad, but it's actually, in some cases, it could be good, right? And I can show that, maybe in one province, when the population was more supportive or something, it was sort of better. And so that would, again, be sort of, I think, a sort of a stronger contribution to trying to arbitrate between these sort of mixed findings.
Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. That's very helpful. I do think, especially with the previous comments, I need to think more about, because in the case I mentioned that, in the case study I mentioned that this particular case, and the indiscriminate repression does seem to actually reduce the violence. So if that's going on in this case, that does add a substantial caveat, and the fact that empirically I find these short-term effects, that maybe that the theory should propose not simply two hypotheses, but hypotheses about short-term and long-term effects of each type of repression. That would add more nuance, and indeed nuance is what I'm finding in the results. And regarding the interaction, that's something that I definitely plan to incorporate. That's very helpful to think, and you're right with counterinsurgency theory. That should be quite relevant. So I'll think about that more and look at it empirically. Or if that doesn't end up being important, that's also interesting. But either way, I need to look at. But I think it should. I think the interaction between the two types of repression should be important. And regarding arbitrating between the different arguments, this is all very helpful. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Okay, let's. I just wanted to quickly throw in just a caution, which isn't substantive at all, which is that in the presentation and in some of the language that you have been using in responding and things like that, it comes across a little bit like, I would just be careful of normative language that you're accidentally using. This is what Will Moore would say, right? Which is that we should be careful about the way we say repression works, or indiscriminate good, or things, success and things like that. So you just want to be a little cautious there. Ursula has. Let's see if this works.
Let's give it a try.
Oh,
Brian, can you hear me better now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. Well, I went upstairs. I think being closer to the Wi-Fi. I'm at home. It's late. Yeah. So I think a lot of good comments already. Maybe I'll follow up with one that relates, I think, some to the point in interactions. So also frame the paper as, essentially speaking to the literature on civil war and the logic of targeting in civil war, selective violence versus indiscriminate violence. One thing that I was missing a bit is like the nature of that violence, and to what extent the rationale for the government using one or the other, matters or doesn't matter for your paper. And the reason I'm saying this is that, to me, it remained unclear whether you see them as complements or substitutes, and whether they would happen in different geographical areas. And I think, now my kids are here and they're distracting me. Please go away. Okay, I'm sorry. So the spatial pattern, I think, would matter, because if it's true, so I think, that would be a problem. I mean, if they happen in different regions, in different provinces, then the interaction probably wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Trying to interact these two types of strategies. And also, I think, if the logic for using one or the other is really different theoretically, them to happen in the same areas. And so for that reason alone, I think it would be really nice and also important to show in the paper a map where you show geographically, spatially, also where do disappearances happen. Well, the leader decapitations, it's a little bit, can you say? But the disappearances, I think it would be interesting to show, to what extent there's overlap spatially between those two different strategies, or are they really different strategies? And so it just, if the Caliban's logic is correct, then they should have places. But if that's not what you think, then I think there should also be a discussion of that. So I was missing a discussion in the paper of what are the dynamics for choosing one or the other strategy from the perspective of the government. I think a relevant issue, particularly because indiscriminate repression seems to be counterproductive, at least in the short term. It also raises the question of, well, why does the government use it in the first place? So I think, you should somewhere in the paper address why you can explain it, right? And probably has something to do with, the coalition supporting the government and them asking for some kind of more escalatory response. But so I think a bit of discussion of the rationale of the government choosing one or the other would help the paper. Okay, so then
could I get Yuri has a two-finger on that, and then you can continue.
Yeah, sure.
Yuri?
I had a similar thought on particularly the empirical analysis that well, it does not address the question of selection of tactics, and it could well be possible that decapitation is only feasible where the intelligence is already pretty good. And you can already tell that government does not choose these tactics at a coin toss just by how sparse the decapitation data are. I may be counting them wrong here, but it looks like there are about 18 targeted killings in your data set. As opposed to over 9,000 disappearances. And so I thought that, well, first of all, there should be some attempt to empirically account for the selection effect. But on a conceptual level, what is the selection process like for these two types of violence? Who makes the decision? How is the operation carried out? What happens? Well, I guess what happens to the victims of disappearances is unclear. But the larger question is, what is the data generating process? Are these really substitutes? Because it seems like the direction of the bias on decapitations is in favor of finding a negative effect on rebel violence, particularly if the government uses these tactics in places where it is already fairly well informed, if it already is plugged into the insurgent network, and it knows how to find these people.
Brian. Oh, can't hear you.
Okay, thanks so much for all this. This is very helpful. First, I want to address Emily's comment about normative issues. This is a great point and one that I'll be more careful with. So thank you. And Ursula, yeah, I tend to think of these things as complements. Maybe I acknowledge there's not as much of this in the paper as maybe there should be. I was trying to sidestep and the good old endogeneity question a little bit, even though there's excellent work by Ritter and Conrad, for example, that shows that these are issues that we need to take into consideration, and other people like Yuri and others do use sophisticated things to take these things into consideration. So this is something I've thought about. Getting directly to your question, though, Ursula, I do think of them as complements. You're right that if they're happening in different areas, interaction might not make sense. This is a good point. I don't know that there's a unique logic behind each one. But this is something we wanted to talk to people here about. But I do think that if the government could only use decapitations, it would have done that. They were putting out wanted posters in 1971 with the names of the leaders of the groups. They were trying to get the leaders, but this is difficult to do. So I think the disappearances were a way to show the public we're trying, we're doing something, in a way to get information, for example. But I do think that ideally they would have only captured the leaders, but this was simply too difficult to do. Selection, I'm not sure. I don't have a good instrument. I'd like to have an instrument for repression or for the different types of repression, but I don't at this point. But I don't have a good instrument. That's one way that I would get at this. I'm not sure if you all are convinced by Granger causality or flipping the independent variable and the dependent variables or different lags. if those are things that would be helpful, please let me know. And these are things that I could try or put more into the paper. I did have more in the paper about this, but because of space issues, I reduced some of the stuff on endogeneity. But this is something that maybe I should incorporate more. And Yuri is right that it could be the case with the leadership removal only happens when the groups are very weak, right? And this would be a substantial endogeneity problem. But I'm not sure that that's always the case. There's this Patrick Johnston paper where he has information not only on the decapitations, but the decapitation attempts, and the attempts are not associated with reduced violence, while the actual kills and captures are. And I think that was a smart way to sort it out. But also qualitatively, I mean, there is some evidence that the decapitations can happen independently of how strong or weak the group is. Reduction in violence after the decapitation happens. But I should think about this more, ways to empirically take this into consideration. And again, I'm not sure how convincing it would be. What if there's suggestions maybe would flipping the model around, where I'm looking to see what are the determinants of disappearances, what are the determinants of decapitation? Would that be something helpful to have in an appendix, or additional temporal lags, if that would be helpful? Let me know. But other than that, I acknowledge that endogeneity and selection are issues that I should include more in the paper. This is true.
Ursula and Yuri, please correct me if I'm characterizing your concerns incorrectly. But it seems to me like the question is that you are presenting these ideas as if you can choose one or the other in the paper, but they may actually be complements or correlated in a way that would not allow you to draw inferences about one or the other. And so if you're saying that they're distinct concepts and in fact they're correlated, then that might be a big problem. And we know that that's commonly the case. Ferris and Schackenberg have a paper in DCR in which they talk about the dependence between different kinds of violations. Now, decapitation isn't a violation in the traditional sense, but it's worth thinking about what you actually mean theoretically and whether that's going to cause problems with your estimates. Is that a correct way that I'm capturing your concerns, Yuri and Ursula?
Yes, more or less. Yeah, I would expect them to be negatively correlated, if anything. But also the larger issue is that we just don't have enough information in this paper to make that assessment independently.
Okay. Ursula.
So I think the other problem I see, if you think that they're used as complements in the same area around the same time, then you really have a problem, right? Because you expect opposite effects on the dependent variable, and they couldn't both materialize. I mean, so it depends on what do you mean by the same area, but given that you use provinces, they're fairly large, so it could still be possible to have one area of a province with one reaction and the other one with a different one. But so that's, I think, in a way, why it would actually be good for you if you expected the spatial patterns to be different, or temporal patterns to be different.
Okay. Yeah, just one response to that about what explains the differences. The disappearances were so widespread, and there's someone actually doing a paper now on the determinants of disappearances, and he finds that this fellow Adam Sharp, with this interesting paper, finds that the training of the members of the military, where they went to college or whatever, there's certain institutional factors that explain why some units used far more disappearances than others. It wasn't a response to the rebel violence, so there's not that reverse causality problem according to his research. But there was, I don't want to use the word random, but there was a lot of randomness, or at least a decent degree of exogeneity to when and why disappearances were used. And the leadership, and I'm not aware of a direct correlation between the two. The leadership removal, there's some interesting cases that I should put into the paper where the leadership removals were almost accidental. They stumbled upon some people in a pizzeria. This wasn't a sophisticated operation. They stumbled upon them. A gunfight broke out, and the police killed the leaders. So in this sense, I do think there is some orthogonality between these two things, but but I need to put that into the paper and explore it more. This is true, and so thank you, Yuri and Ursula, for these comments.
Cyanne.
Brian, a bunch of my comments have been brought up already. So, but because you just mentioned examples, I will follow up with that. I know you're short on space, but there's a couple of places where I think you could do a better job of that, including when you talk about on page 31, the positive relationship between disappearances and subsequent violence, and then you kind of say regarding the data at hand, evidence illustrates this through a case analysis, but then you don't actually give us any of that evidence. So there's just a couple of places like that that I would keep an eye out for. You obviously have a very rich knowledge of the case, and I think it's worth finding the space to put some of that information in. That causal story may help Yuri and Ursula a little bit with some of their comments or concerns.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much. I will find space to put that stuff in then. I appreciate it.
Jacob.
I also wanted to jump on the selection train. So at least my limited understanding of this case is that the government really sort of went after leftist political activists. That's sort of the vast majority of the disappearances. And those leftist political activists were also, a good number of them were at least sort of tangentially involved with the rebels. So repression was not, totally random. It was definitely selected to target people who were sort of likely supporters or sort of the likely support network of the rebel, which also means that these kind of disappearances probably occurred in places where the rebel had a much stronger support base. So these are sort of more difficult cases, right, where the government sort of was almost forced to try to address the sort of stronger rebel support base in these areas, in addition to sort of using more selective means to tackle to destroy the rebel. So I think that sort of selection issue is an important one to consider as well. On the sort of decapitation, I think there's a possible sort of omitted variable there. In the sense that these decapitations frequently occurred in the context sort of firefights with the government. So things like search and destroy missions, all kinds of sort of kinetic government activity that, in addition to killing the leader, also killed off 50, 60 sort of militants. And so the government did a lot of sort of military activity. This is a case where, most of these things end with some sort of political sort of ending. This, like the government, almost annihilated the rebel groups, right? They killed off almost all the sort of militant members. So there's this really important sort of kinetic activity I think is missing from the paper that may be related to some of the other variables in the models. And then sort of one final comment here. So you're talking about the empirics, how to get at some of these endogeneity issues. I think one way to do it would be to put together something that looks like kind of a difference in difference, where you'd look at how sort of changes in your key variable influences changes in your dependent variable, right? So how does changes in the amount of disappearances influence the changes in rebel violence, and that way you'd at least be trying to account for the fact that some areas have much higher baseline of violence than sort of other areas, and to sort of go even a step farther, because difference in difference requires parallel trends. You could sort of match on the province's history, and then you'd be much more confident that you're sort of comparing like provinces, and then figuring out how your treatment is actually sort of influencing your response variable on that.
Brian.
Okay, yeah, you're right. That the disappearances were not completely random, but the idea that they were the likely support network means that this is a very, very broad pool of people throughout the country. But as you say, not completely random. Regarding kinetic government activity, I do have a variable. I should have mentioned this or should include it. I do have a variable indicating people killed by the government. It's a long story, but only for certain years, but maybe I could look at only those years and include that variable and see what happens, because you're right, the other kinetic activity certainly is important, because that's how the leadership removals happened at times. And diff and diff with matching, potentially, that's helpful. Yeah, I should look at that. Thank you.
I actually have an open queue.
Can I jump back in then? If
Yeah.
anyone has a,
Yeah, sure.
So just
And then I've got Yuri after that.
Okay, so just sort of a quick data consideration. I know this may not be entirely solvable, and you did sort of talk about it in the presentation, but the dependent variable, they claim terrorism. You say that it has both. At least the discussion in the paper didn't have me convinced that it had both, or at least that it didn't sort of systematically record rebel activity against both civilians and sort of government forces. So you may be running into a problem kind of like the GTD, where they had both, but they didn't systematically record sort of guerrilla activity by the rebel. And so then this means that your dependent variable sort of overcounts attacks against civilians, and we know that groups that are attacking more civilians than government forces, it may be a sign of weakness as opposed to sort of a sign of strength.
Okay, that's a good point, right? I definitely, even though I'm generally a big fan of the GTD, I use it for other things. But when you look at it in a single country, because I've compared the GTD data to this data, enormous differences. But I'm pretty confident that this, with the level of capacity that Argentina has and the record keeping, that this is not only attacks on the government. That there's a great deal of information because of the type of reconciliation process that happened in the 1980s and 90s here. There were efforts to find information about everybody. And so anybody who was a victim of the rebel groups, whether they were a civilian or a member of the military, I do think there is good information on that. But that's something I could discuss more too, because I don't want people to think that it's mostly terrorism or mostly guerrilla activity. But I do think it does include both, and it's pretty comprehensive.
Yuri.
I have a question on measurement. So an alternative interpretation of your two measures of decapitation and disappearances is killing leaders versus killing rank and file supporters, whether active members of the rebellion or passive civilians who are members of the support base. And so basically what I would have liked to see is some justification of your assumption that disappearances are indiscriminate. You brought this up a little bit in your talk, I think to a greater extent than you did even in the paper. But do you have statistics on, say, what proportion of the disappearances were elderly, children, women, basically someone other than a military-age male? That'll be one quick way with just a descriptive stat that you can justify how indiscriminate these were. Yeah, so that's that was my thinking.
I've got two fingers from Cyanne on that, real quick.
Yeah, I mean, at least in the Nepal case, the other thing I would add is you may be able to get data on political party affiliation or something like that. So, and be able to separate out a legitimate political target from indiscriminate violence.
Brian.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I do have age for a lot of these people, so I should look at that. That's a great idea, Yuri. That's very helpful. And Cyanne also about political affiliation. If I can get that, that would be excellent. One thing I do know is that they were more than 1/3 female. The victims of the disappearances were more than 1/3 female, which, I mean, obviously that's not parity with the general population, but that does suggest that it wasn't only the members of the militant groups. But a different way to frame this paper, although not completely accurate, would be killing the leaders of the groups versus, as Yuri says, killing the support base, because that was at least the government's intention. But because so many more people were disappeared than simply the support base, as I say, roommates, friends, family members, entire classrooms in universities, entire unions. So if it's a very loose definition of support base is the thing. I mean, maybe that's a different interpretation. It would be a different way to frame the paper. Killing the leaders versus killing the support base, and I thought about that. But I think it's somewhere in between the support base and purely indiscriminate. And so maybe I need to think about which way would be better to frame it. But it's not purely indiscriminate, and it's not purely the support base. To be direct to your question, Yuri.
Ursula, oh, two fingers from Cyanne and then Ursula.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that case a little bit more. So does it have something to do with government threat? Is there important variations in how the government perceived the threat coming from the general population or the support base versus individual leaders?
Like that the government saw more of a threat from the general public than they did from the leaders?
Or just how was, maybe I'll frame it more as a question, how was the government conceiving of the threat from the general population? So why bother wiping out an entire classroom? What was the government trying to achieve?
The government was trying to crush dissidents, right? There's this famous quote from a leader saying that, although I forget the famous quote exactly, but it's something like saying that the dissidence is terrorism, that believing revolutionary ideas is terrorism. So there was this very broad idea of just trying to eliminate all opposition, anybody who's not patriotic, eliminate them. This idea of the national, just reorganizing, restructuring the country and eliminating all opposition. So at least the intention was quite general, quite broad, and far beyond people carrying weapons, actual members of militant groups.
Does Cyanne, are you? Okay, Ursula?
Yes, thanks. So I'm turning my video off because that doesn't help with the audio quality. So first, to just follow up on a couple of things that have been said, and then I do have a separate point as well. So, I mean, when I was reading the paper, I actually wondered why you felt that you had to present these two strategies from the government as these ITL types. Like on one hand we have indiscriminate, and then completely on the opposite end of the spectrum we have selective targeting. Because I mean, it's very easy for you to say and argue that the disappearances are less selective than the leadership decapitations, right? So I think if it's going to be difficult to show that disappearances were truly indiscriminate, why can't you argue instead that they were simply clearly less selective than the leadership removals? So I wonder, to what extent is it necessary for you to maintain that ideal type distinction between indiscriminate and selective violence? And I just also want to second a couple of things that were suggested. So I think, some things that would go a long way if you would present some additional validation of your independent variables, even if you can't, use control variables to capture things such as group strength or state strength, right, which could be an alternative explanation for your findings. I mean, maybe you could think about some empirical implications where you could show, scatter plots, or, using things such as, or using patterns such as, the age of the targets, or any other kind of information that you could acquire that show that the general pattern seems to fit with your argument and not so much with alternative explanations, even if you can't include it in an empirical model. Because I think, you already have quite a bit in terms of robustness tests. It might be nice to actually, move some of that material in the appendix, and in that appendix also describe in more detail why your assumption that the disappearances are much less selective is accurate, and so forth. So I think that would be really helpful. So coming to the point that I said I was going to make, to me in the paper it was a bit unclear what the role of the qualitative material is. Because the way you describe it in the abstract almost suggests that you have both like a qualitative and a quantitative test of the empirical argument. Then in the paper itself, it becomes clearer that actually the qualitative evidence is more illustrative. So it's not, a test of the argument, but the abstract suggests that you're actually doing a mixed methods piece, which I don't think you fully do. And actually, in a way, given that you said you're in Argentina and you have a lot of connections, I mean, that actually be another way for really, strengthening parts of the paper that people have raised questions about, right? I mean, you could perhaps interview some people that have family members who disappeared. Maybe you could interview some members of the rebel organizations. I don't know if it's feasible, but if it would be, I think it would be a really nice way to more convincingly have a qualitative element to the piece. Because right now, I mean, you use some quotes, but a lot of the quotes are also from secondary sources, and also part of the qualitative case is then showing the descriptive pattern that actually comes from the data that you're using in the quantitative empirical test. So that to me made it a bit less convincing as well. This is really adding a lot of qualitative material. And you know, if you would have access to some of those sources, I think it would be a great way of making the paper even stronger.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, this is interesting, especially the idea of looking at the patterns. For example, the age of targets over time. That would be really interesting. And I take your point about more qualitative work, taking advantage of being here to put more of that into the paper. That is something I plan to do. So I will do that. But one general question, because there is this issue of to what extent the disappearances were indiscriminate. So then if I could ask you all, I mean, would it be worth thinking about shifting the framing of the paper from selective to indiscriminate to killing leaders versus targeting the support base, targeting leaders versus targeting the support base? Is that a more effective way to frame the paper? I have tried to make it more cautious, and instead of saying indiscriminate, using the term less discriminate a lot. But should I maybe just get rid of less discriminate and say targeting the support base? I would wonder what you all might think about that.
Thoughts? Yuri?
I'd be in favor. Yeah, I think yeah, I think they'll be at least as defensible as what you have there now, and I've seen fewer efforts along those lines than to compare selective and indiscriminate. I think it's worth trying.
Mm-hmm. Any other votes on that?
I agree. I would also add in that government kinetic activity is important. So the government can kill off rank and file members, it can kill off leaders, or it can try to sort of drain the sea. Those are all important sort of strategies the government can use, and they're all probably going to be used in various cases. It'll be interesting to compare.
Jacob, you're next in the queue if you want to take it. And then we have about 5 minutes. Oh, now we can't hear you. Hi, Cyanne. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Jacob?
I'm sorry, I think I had the mute on.
There we go.
So I had a couple comments. One sort of theoretic, so let me start with that. You assume that the incentives for violence are observed sort of additively. So that if you have 3 incentives for violence, you'll get 3 times as much violence than if you have 2 incentives for violence. And I'm not sure I buy that. So if the rebel wants to respond, if the rebel wants to show that it was actually not weakened by some government attack or something, I would think that it would use just as much violence as if it wanted to show the population that it could sort of still protect them. So I would think that any reason to use violence, the rebel would sort of use violence, and that if they have 3 reasons versus 2 reasons, it doesn't necessarily show up as sort of more violence. I think what's more convincing on that is whether or not indiscriminate versus more selective influences the capacity of the group. So a lot of the sort of existing arguments, Colley-Voss, the information-centric model, these kind of things, they're all about capacities. So if civilians now have a security incentive to join the rebel, that increases rebel capacities to produce violence. If civilians are less likely to provide information to the state, that decreases the ability of the state to kill off or capture rebels, which enables the rebels to engage in sort of more activity, that kind of thing. So I thought capacity is a clear explanation for why we observe more or less violence than the sort of the incentives for violence. That just would tell us that we should see violence. It doesn't necessarily tell us how much violence we should see. So a couple of things. The time period. So you cut it a couple ways, which I think is great. I'm used to using sort of UCDP. So the first thing I did is look up when they have the conflict ongoing. So they have the conflict ongoing, it's basically late 1974 to 1977. And of course, they're just recording when battles between governments and rebel forces are occurring. But I'm wondering if maybe there's something different about that period when battles are actually occurring, when there's actually insurgency and fighting, as opposed to the period before, when maybe it was more like trying to build up name recognition. And then after 1977, when the group was, or both groups were pretty decimated and had very little capacity to sort of do much. So I'd also like to see maybe that time period looked at. Is there something different about that time period as opposed to the broader time period? And then the final comment, you include the spatial lag, which is good, but I think in this case, there's an argument to be made that the spatial lag is actually potentially a mediating variable. So I was reading up on some of the actual sort of activity, and one sort of consistent description is the government would be able to kill off a lot of rebels, and in response, the rebels would send recruits from neighboring provinces over into that current province to sort of make up for the losses. And so basically, attacks in the current province leads to less attacks in the neighboring province, which then leads to more attacks in the province here. So that's potentially sort of a consideration. By including that potentially mediating variable, you've introduced bias into your sort of estimates for other variables. That's it.
Okay, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I mean, I agree that capacity is probably more important than incentives, but I think that incentives are important. Regarding the notion, I should be clear that I don't think that three reasons to use violence are going to lead to a proportionate increase in violence that is greater than 2 reasons to use violence. But in general, the more reasons there are to use violence, the more likely there is. It's about likelihood, I suppose. The more likely we are to see some sort of violence, but it should be more clear about that. And the UCDP years, yeah, I do think interesting things were going on that lead the conflict to be coded as a civil conflict by UCDP, when there is two-sided violence and at a substantial level of combatants, on both sides being killed. So there were some different dynamics going on. Maybe empirically I should look at that, at those particular years instead of just the post-coup years, to see if the results hold then as well, or if something different was going on then as well, because that would be interesting. The spatial lag maybe could be mediating. I should definitely try models without it to make sure it isn't introducing bias, as you suggest. Possibly also an interaction, though, could be interesting. But I do want to make sure that it's not introducing problems, so I will look into that. Thank you.
We're about out of time, and so if anybody has any last minute quickie things, and if there are more comments for Brian, I would urge our discussants to email him any other thoughts. And Brian, if you have any kind of last up final notes that you wanted to say.
No, just huge thank you to everybody involved. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for presenting this paper, for sharing it with us, and thanks to Cyanne Loyle and Jacob Aronson and Yuri Zhukov and Ursula Daxecker for their excellent comments. Thank you for working hard through all the technical issues that we have been having, and thank you for reading it closely and giving great comments to Brian. I would encourage everyone to tune in 2 weeks. On October 30th, Nadia Kostyuk and Carly Wayne, both of the University of Michigan, will be presenting the paper Communicating Cyber Risk, How Exposure to Cyber Attacks Impacts Support for Cyber Protection Policies. And with that, I'll thank you all.